Welcome to Sleepwalk Files. Tonight, we are taking a calm, close look at the disappearance of Flight MH370. Subscribe for daily stories about strange mysteries made to fall asleep to. How does a modern Boeing 777 simply cease to exist in the sky? It is a question that sounds like the beginning of a ghost story, but it is the central fact of a real-world tragedy. We are talking about a machine that weighs over 200,000 pounds, painted in a bright, recognizable livery, equipped with dozens of transponders and carrying 239 souls. In the modern era of aviation, the sky is not an empty void. It is a grid. It is a mapped, monitored and measured space where planes are tracked by radar, satellites and constant radio chatter. To vanish from that grid is not just a technical failure. It is almost an impossibility. Yet on March 8, 2014, Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 did exactly that. It didn't just crash. It didn't just lose radio contact. It disappeared. For years, the world looked at a map of the Indian Ocean and saw nothing but blue. There were no oil slicks, no floating suitcases, and no black boxes singing their final pings into the deep. For a long time, the plane was a ghost, a mathematical probability rather than a physical object. The internet became a breeding ground for theories because the void was too large to accept. People began to imagine secret military bases, portals, or intentional hijackings to a land that didn't exist on any map. When there is no evidence, the human mind fills the gap with mythology. But then, the ghost left a fingerprint. Fast forward to July 2015. The setting is Réunion Island, a French territory in the middle of the Indian Ocean, thousands of miles away from where the plane had originally been flying. A beachcomber walking along the shore spotted something strange tangled in the driftwood. It was a piece of aircraft debris, a curved, metallic part of a wing. Specifically, it was a flaperon. In aviation, a flaperon is a critical component that helps control the lift and roll of the aircraft. It is not a generic piece of scrap metal. It is a highly specialized part with a unique manufacturing signature. When investigators analyzed the piece, they didn't just find a part that looked like it belonged to a Boeing 777. They found a part that matched the specific serial numbers and billed records of Flight 370. This was the first concrete, physical proof that the plane had not been teleported or hidden in a hangar. It had broken apart. It had hit the water. The flaperon had survived the impact, drifted through the currents of the ocean for over a year, and finally washed up on a distant shore to tell a very small part of the story. The discovery of the flaperon changed everything, but it also deepened the mystery. If a piece of the wing was on Réunion Island, it meant the plane had ended up in the southern Indian Ocean, far south of its intended path to Beijing. It confirmed that the aircraft had flown for hours after it disappeared from the radar screens. It turned the mystery from a question of if the plane crashed into a question of why it went there. Think about the scale of that distance. The flight was supposed to be a routine trip from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing. Instead, the debris suggests a journey into one of the most remote and hostile environments on Earth. The southern Indian Ocean is a place of crushing depths and unpredictable storms. Finding a single piece of a wing is like finding a single puzzle piece in the middle of a desert. It proves the puzzle exists, but it doesn't tell you what the picture is. This is where the obsession begins. For the families of the 239 people on board, the flaperon was a cruel tease. It was proof of death, but not an explanation for it. For the rest of the world, it was a clue in a global detective story. The internet forums, from Reddit to specialized aviation boards, erupted. People began obsessing over current maps, trying to calculate how a piece of metal could drift from a crash site to a French island. They looked at wind patterns and ocean salinity. They treated the ocean like a crime scene, searching for any other scrap of white and blue paint that might wash up on the shores of Africa or Australia. But the flaperon only answered one question. It didn't explain the silence. It didn't explain the missing voices. And it certainly didn't explain how a crew of experienced pilots could steer a massive jet away from its destination and into the void without a single distress signal. To understand that, we have to go back to the very beginning. We have to look at the moment the plane was still visible and the exact second the world stopped hearing from it. If you look at a map of the flight path for Malaysia Airlines Flight 370, it looks like a simple, straight line cutting across the South China Sea. It was a routine journey from Kuala Lumpur International Airport to Beijing Capital International Airport. On the night of March 8, 2014, everything about the departure seemed ordinary. The Boeing 777 took off into a clear night, climbed to its cruising altitude, and followed the standard corridors of the sky. For the first 40 minutes, the plane was a predictable dot on a screen, chatting with air traffic controllers and ticking off the milestones of a boring, safe flight. But there is a specific point in the air where the story stops being a flight record and starts becoming a ghost story. That point is the handover. In aviation, the sky is divided into sectors. When a plane leaves one sector, the controllers in that area hand the aircraft over to the next team. It is a digital baton pass. At 1:19 a.m., Flight 370 was exiting the airspace controlled by Kuala Lumpur and entering the airspace managed by Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam. This is the precise moment the world began to lose its grip on the aircraft. The final words from the cockpit were not a cry for help or a report of an engine failure. They were simple, professional, and hauntingly calm. The pilot said, "Good night, Malaysian 370. For a few seconds, those words hung in the air. Then, the plane didn't just stop talking. It stopped existing on the primary screens. Within minutes, the transponder, which acts like a digital lighthouse telling the world where the plane is and how high it is flying, was manually turned off. Imagine being a controller in a dark room, watching a glowing green icon representing 239 lives, and seeing that icon simply blink out of existence. It didn't fade. It didn't drift. It vanished. This is where the mystery takes a turn into the surreal. If a plane suffers a catastrophic failure, like an explosion or a sudden dive, the radar usually captures a descent. You see a plummet, you see a streak, but Flight 370 didn't plummet. It stepped out of the light. The transition point between Malaysia and Vietnam became a wall. On one side of that wall, the plane was a known entity following a flight plan. On the other side, it became a phantom. The internet has spent a decade obsessing over those final seconds. If you wander into the depths of aviation forums or the conspiracy threads of Reddit, you will find people who have mapped out every single second of that handover. They argue about the timing. They analyze the phrasing of the pilot's sign-off. Some claim that the good night was too casual, while others argue it was perfectly standard. They look for a hidden meaning in the silence that followed. The fascination comes from the contrast. We live in an age of total surveillance. We have GPS in our pockets and satellites that can read a license plate from space. The idea that a massive 200-ton piece of machinery could simply slide through a crack in the system is offensive to our modern sense of security. But the reality is that the radar technology used in that specific region of the sky had gaps. The controllers in Vietnam and Malaysia were looking at different screens, using different systems. For a brief window of time, the plane was in a blind spot. It was in the gap between two jurisdictions. In the official logs, this is recorded as a loss of communication, but to the people watching the screens, it felt like a magic trick. The plane had walked through a door and closed it behind itself. As the minutes ticked by and the plane failed to check in with the Vietnamese controllers, the confusion began to set in. At first, they thought it was a technical glitch. They assumed the radio was broken or the transponder had malfunctioned. They didn't imagine that the plane was actually gone. They didn't imagine that while they were staring at empty screens, the aircraft was potentially doing something it was never supposed to do. The transition point wasn't just a change in air traffic control. It was the moment the flight plan was abandoned. The aircraft was no longer heading toward Beijing. It was no longer following the coordinates programmed into its computer. It had reached the edge of the known world, and then it turned. The question shifted from where is the plane to why did it leave the path. The silence wasn't an accident of technology. The silence was a choice. And that choice is what makes the transition point the most chilling part of the map. If you look at a map of the sky, flight paths look like neat, predictable highways. Pilots follow specific waypoints, a series of invisible markers that ensure they stay in the right lane and under the watch of the right people. But on the night of March 8, 2014, one of those highways simply ended. The strange detail isn't that the plane vanished, but that before it disappeared completely, it left a ghost trail. While the world was being told the plane had simply vanished into thin air, the primary radar was recording something entirely different. It was recording a U-turn. To understand this, we have to look at the difference between the two types of radar used that night. There is secondary radar, which relies on a transponder inside the plane to shout its identity and position back to the ground. That is the system that went silent. But then there is primary radar. Primary radar doesn't need the plane to talk. It just bounces a radio wave off the physical metal of the aircraft. It is a blunt instrument, and it doesn't tell you the flight number or the altitude, but it tells you that something heavy and metallic is moving through the air. According to the primary radar data recovered later, Flight 370 didn't just stop existing. After the radio went silent at the boundary between Malaysian and Vietnamese airspace, the aircraft made a sharp, deliberate turn back toward the west. It didn't drift. It didn't spiral. It banked. The data shows the plane crossing back over the Malay Peninsula, slicing through the night sky in a direction that took it further and further away from Beijing. Imagine the scene in the control rooms. On the secondary radar screens, there was a void, a missing piece of the puzzle. But on the primary radar, a nameless blip was moving across the map, ignoring every protocol in the book. It flew over the coast, heading back toward the heart of Malaysia, and then it turned again. It didn't follow a standard airway. It flew along the border of Malaysian and Thai airspace, almost as if it were trying to stay in a blind spot, hugging the edge of the radar coverage to avoid being identified. This is the moment the mystery stops being about a technical failure and starts feeling like a puzzle. Mechanical failure, like an engine flameout or a sudden loss of pressure, usually results in a descent. Planes that break usually go down. They don't perform complex navigational maneuvers. They don't fly hundreds of miles in the opposite direction of their destination. The primary radar shows a flight that was still under control. The wings were level, the speed was steady, and the direction was intentional. For a few hours, the plane was a ghost. It was visible to the machines, but invisible to the people. Military radar in Malaysia had picked up an unidentified aircraft, but because the transponder was off, the operators didn't immediately connect that blip to the missing Boeing 777. They saw a target, but they didn't see a passenger jet. By the time the dots were connected, the blip had already crossed the coast and headed out over the Andaman Sea, disappearing into the vast, empty blue of the Indian Ocean. This specific sequence of events is what fuels the endless debates on forums like Reddit and in aviation circles. If the plane was flying a controlled path, who was at the controls? The primary radar tells us the aircraft was functioning. It tells us that the engines were running and the flaps were set for cruise. It turns a disappearance into a diversion. The timeline of those first few hours is a study in delayed realization. While the families of the passengers were still waiting for a landing announcement in Beijing, the plane had already performed a wide, sweeping arc that took it thousands of miles off course. The primary radar data is the only physical record we have of the plane's final movements in the east. It is a digital footprint of a flight that had decided to stop being a commercial journey and start being a secret. When we look at that turn on the map, we aren't looking at a crash site. We are looking at a decision. The primary radar doesn't tell us why the plane turned or who gave the order to deviate from the path, but it proves that the plane didn't just vanish. It was steered. It was guided. And as it crossed the coastline and headed south, it left behind a trail of questions that no amount of radar data could ever truly answer. The plane had stopped talking to the world, but it was still moving, carving a lonely line across the map toward a destination that didn't exist on any flight plan. If the radar showed a plane that had been steered, we have to ask who was doing the steering. Find the answer, we have to stop looking at the blips on a screen and start looking at the people. There were 239 souls on board the Boeing 777. For a long time, they were just a number in a manifest, a list of names that represented a cross-section of the world. There were businessmen, families traveling for vacation, and crew members who had flown these routes 100 times before. When you look at the passenger list, you see a routine flight. But in the world of forensic investigation, a manifest is more than a list. It is a map of lives, and every name on that list became a potential lead for investigators trying to understand why a plane would suddenly deviate from its path. Then there are the people in the cockpit. Captain Zahiri Ahmad Shah was a veteran pilot with thousands of hours of experience. He wasn't a novice. He knew the aircraft, he knew the systems, and he knew exactly how to make a plane invisible to the world. Beside him was First Officer Farik Abdul Hamid, a younger pilot who was still gaining the kind of experience Zahiri already possessed. In the early hours of March 8, 2014, these two men were the only ones who knew what was happening in the sky. The official logs and the communication records between the cockpit and air traffic control are where the mystery becomes hauntingly concrete. For the first part of the journey, everything was textbook. The plane took off from Kuala Lumpur International Airport, climbing steadily into the night. The pilots were professional. The tone was calm. The logs show the standard handoffs from one air traffic control center to the next. But then we reach the gap. The last words spoken by the crew are perhaps the most famous and chilling lines in aviation history. As the plane approached the edge of Malaysian airspace, the pilot signed off with a simple, routine phrase. "Good night, Malaysian 370. Those 4 words were the last human voice ever heard from the aircraft. There was no distress signal, no report of an engine failure, no scream of panic, just a polite farewell. Within minutes of that sign-off, the plane's transponder was turned off. The transponder is the device that tells the world who the plane is, how high it is, and where it is going. By switching it off, the pilots effectively turned off the lights in a dark room. They didn't disappear from the physical world, but they disappeared from the digital one. This is the detail that keeps people awake on internet forums. Why would a crew turn off the transponder at the exact moment they were transitioning between 2 different air traffic control zones? In aviation, this is known as the handover point, a moment of vulnerability where the responsibility for the aircraft shifts from one center to another. To a skeptic, it looks like a tragic coincidence or a technical glitch. To a theorist, it looks like a calculated move. It looks like someone who knew exactly where the blind spots were. The official logs show a silence that is deafening. After the good night, there is nothing. No radio calls from the cockpit and no responses to the confused queries from the ground. While the controllers were staring at empty screens, wondering if there had been a sudden catastrophe, the plane was still flying. It was still carving that wide, sweeping arc back across the peninsula. The logs tell us that the ground crew believed the plane was still on its way to Beijing for a significant amount of time. The disconnect between what was happening in the air and what was recorded on the ground created a vacuum of information that the public has been trying to fill for a decade. When you read the transcripts, you realize that the tragedy isn't just in the loss of the plane, but in the normalcy of the final moments. There is something deeply unsettling about a routine sign-off followed by a total disappearance. It suggests that whatever happened next wasn't a sudden explosion or a violent event. It suggests a transition. The plane didn't fall out of the sky. It stepped out of the conversation. This is why the passenger manifest and the cockpit logs are so heavily scrutinized. Investigators looked for a motive. They looked for a reason why a veteran captain and a junior officer would suddenly stop communicating. They searched for any sign of instability, any hidden debt, any political grievance. They looked for a ghost in the machine or a shadow in the crew's history. But the logs remain stubbornly empty. They provide the timeline of the silence, but they don't provide the reason for it. We are left with a record of a flight that said good night and then decided to never wake up. If the plane had simply crashed shortly after it vanished from the radar, the mystery would have been solved in a matter of days. But there is a specific, technical detail that changes everything. It is called a handshake. In the world of satellite communications, a handshake is a brief, automatic signal sent between an aircraft and a satellite to keep the connection alive. Even after the pilot stopped talking to air traffic control, and even after the plane's transponder was switched off, the aircraft continued to whisper to a satellite owned by a company called Inmarsat. These handshakes didn't provide a location, but they provided a time and a distance. For 7 hours, the plane was essentially checking in, letting a computer in a remote facility know that it was still powered on and still flying. This is the most haunting piece of evidence in the entire case. It means that for hours after the world thought the plane had disappeared, it was actually carving a path through the dark. It wasn't a sudden plunge into the sea. It was a long, sustained journey into the void. When investigators analyzed the timing of these pings, they realized the plane hadn't just drifted, it had been steered. The data suggested that after turning back across the Malay Peninsula, the aircraft made another turn, heading south. It flew over the Indian Ocean, far away from any shipping lanes or populated islands. The Inmarsat data indicated that the plane continued to fly until it finally ran out of fuel, somewhere in the southern reaches of the ocean, thousands of miles from where it was supposed to be. This leads us to a question that investigators have spent years debating in closed rooms. Would a single person have intentionally steered the plane into the void? To do this, someone would have had to know exactly how to disable the communication systems without triggering an immediate alarm. They would have had to navigate a massive Boeing 777 through the night, avoiding radar detection by hugging the borders of different flight information regions. This wasn't a random act of panic. It looked like a plan. The focus naturally shifted to the cockpit. The captain, Zahiri Ahmad Shah, was a veteran pilot with thousands of hours of experience. He knew the aircraft inside and out. Investigators later discovered a home flight simulator in his residence. When they recovered the data from that simulator, they found a deleted flight path that mirrored the actual route the plane took on March 8th. It wasn't an exact match, but it was close enough to raise a devastating suspicion. The theory emerged that the captain had practiced this specific route, preparing for a flight that had no destination. This theory suggests a calculated act of mass murder and suicide. It posits that the cockpit door was locked, the electronics were silenced, and the plane was flown until the tanks were dry. It is a cold, clinical explanation for a tragedy. It replaces the mystery of a vanishing plane with the horror of a human choice. For many, this explanation feels too simple. It doesn't account for the silence of the passengers or the lack of a struggle. It asks us to believe that one man could hold 238 other lives in the palm of his hand and steer them all into a watery grave without a single distress signal being sent. The internet has become a breeding ground for alternatives to this theory. On forums like Reddit, users pore over the Inmarsat data, claiming the pings were spoofed or that the plane was diverted by a third party. Some suggest the aircraft was remotely hijacked using a hidden system, while others believe the plane was intercepted by a military force and flown to a secret location. These claims often rely on fragmented data or misinterpreted technical logs, but they persist because the official theory leaves a void of emotion. People struggle to accept that such a massive machine could be used as a tool for a private, dark impulse. The Inmarsat handshakes are the only reason we know the plane went south. Without those pings, we would still be searching the South China Sea. But those same pings are what make the story so unsettling. They prove that the plane existed in a state of limbo for hours. It was a ghost ship in the sky, flying a path that served no purpose other than to disappear. Every single ping was a heartbeat, marking the seconds as the aircraft moved further away from help and closer to the bottom of the ocean. It turns the flight into a countdown, a slow descent into a place where no one could hear them scream. What if the silence wasn't a choice? For years, we have looked at the turn back across the Malay Peninsula and the long, lonely flight south as the actions of a human mind. But there is another possibility, one that doesn't require a villain or a conspiracy. It is the possibility that the plane became a tomb long before it ever hit the water. In aviation, there is a terrifying phenomenon known as hypoxia. It happens when the oxygen levels in the cabin drop so low that the brain simply stops functioning. You don't feel like you're suffocating. Instead, you feel a strange sense of euphoria, a drifting confusion, and then a deep, heavy sleep. If a rapid decompression event occurred shortly after the plane vanished from secondary radar, the cockpit and the cabin would have become an oxygen-deprived void. Within minutes, every person on board, from the pilots to the passengers in row 40, would have slipped into unconsciousness. This theory suggests that the plane didn't fly south because someone steered it there, but because the autopilot was still engaged. The aircraft became a ghost ship, a massive piece of machinery continuing to follow its last programmed command while the people inside were frozen in a state of waking sleep. Some investigators have pointed to the possibility of a catastrophic electrical failure. A Boeing 777 is a city of wires and sensors. If a massive short circuit or an onboard fire had ripped through the electronics, it could explain why the transponders were turned off and why the communication systems went dead. An electrical fire in the crown of the aircraft can release toxic smoke that incapacitates a crew in seconds. In this scenario, the pilots weren't hiding. They were fighting a losing battle against a machine that was failing them. They might have tried to turn the plane back toward land, searching for the nearest runway, only for the fire to win. This mechanical theory is supported by those who find the pilot suicide narrative too convenient. They argue that if a pilot intended to kill everyone on board, they would have likely sent a message or left some trace of a struggle. Instead, the transition from a routine flight to a silent disappearance was seamless. There were no frantic calls, no screams over the radio, and no evidence of a fight in the cockpit. A sudden loss of cabin pressure or a flash fire explains the silence perfectly. It turns the tragedy from a crime into a mechanical failure of epic proportions. But the mechanical theory has its own holes. If the plane was flying on autopilot for 7 hours, why did it make those specific turns? Why did it fly in a way that seemed to avoid radar detection? Skeptics of the ghost flight theory argue that autopilot can keep a plane level, but it cannot navigate a complex path across the ocean without human input or a pre-programmed flight plan. They ask why the plane didn't simply fly straight until it ran out of fuel. The movements of the aircraft suggest a level of intent that a malfunctioning computer simply doesn't possess. Still, the idea of a mechanical catastrophe is far more comforting to the public than the idea of a betrayal. It allows us to blame the machine rather than the man. It turns the mystery into a puzzle of engineering and physics rather than a study of human darkness. On aviation forums, engineers debate the specifics of the 777's electrical architecture, searching for a single point of failure that could explain everything. They look for a specific wire, a faulty seal, or a hidden leak that could have turned a routine trip to Beijing into a drift toward the southern Indian Ocean. The fascination with this theory persists because it fits the evidence of the debris. The flaperon found on Reunion Island was damaged in a way that some experts claim suggests a high-speed impact with the water. If the plane had been glided down by a pilot, the debris might look different. A ghost plane flying on autopilot until the engines finally gasped their last breath of fuel would have fallen from the sky like a stone. Would have hit the ocean with a violence that would shatter the fuselage into 1,000,000 pieces, scattering them across thousands of miles of current. When we think about the people on board, the hypoxia theory is almost more haunting than the crime theory. It suggests that for the last few hours of their lives, the passengers of Flight 370 weren't afraid. They weren't screaming or fighting. They were simply asleep, dreaming of their destination, while the plane carried them further and further into the void. It transforms the flight into a long, silent glide toward an inevitable end, governed by the cold logic of an autopilot system that didn't know its passengers were gone. It leaves us wondering if the most terrifying thing about the disappearance isn't what happened, but how quietly it all occurred. When a mystery remains unsolved for a decade, the human mind stops looking for evidence and starts looking for patterns. In the case of Flight 370, the void left by the official investigation was quickly filled by the internet. If the government cannot tell us where the plane is, the logic goes, then perhaps the reason is something they aren't allowed to tell us. This is how a tragedy of aviation transforms into a mythology of the occult and the clandestine. On platforms like Reddit and in various UFO communities, the conversation shifted away from fuel loads and satellite pings towards something far more cinematic. One of the most persistent rumors involves what users call the airliner video. For years, a grainy clip has circulated in the darker corners of the web, claiming to show a large commercial jet being intercepted or manipulated by an unidentified aerial phenomenon. Some forum users argued that the timing of the video's upload, which allegedly appeared just days after the disappearance, proved it was a leaked piece of evidence from a government agency. They claimed that the plane didn't crash at all, but was instead plucked from the sky by a technology we don't understand or steered toward a secret military installation. These theories often point to Diego Garcia, a remote military base in the central Indian Ocean. Because of its strategic location and its high level of secrecy, the base became a magnet for speculation. The claim was simple. The plane was diverted to the island, either by force or by a secret agreement, and the wreckage was hidden to protect a national security secret. There were posts claiming that satellite imagery showed a Boeing 777 on the tarmac of the base in the days following March 8th. However, these claims remain just that, claims. No official document, no whistleblower, and no piece of physical evidence ever placed the aircraft on the island. The base remained a ghost in the story, a convenient place for the plane to hide in the minds of those who couldn't accept a random, violent end in the deep ocean. The fascination with these theories speaks to a specific kind of modern anxiety. We live in an age of total surveillance. We have GPS in our pockets, satellites that can read a license plate from space, and radar that tracks every move of every commercial flight. The idea that a massive 200-ton machine could simply vanish is a glitch in our understanding of reality. To some, it is more comforting to believe in a conspiracy or even in aliens than to believe that the world is still big enough and dangerous enough for a plane to disappear without a trace. A conspiracy implies a plan. It implies that someone, somewhere, knows exactly what happened. The alternative is far more unsettling, that the ocean is an indifferent graveyard and some secrets are simply lost. As the years passed, the folklore grew. Some threads on the conspiracy subreddit began to link the flight to secret experiments in teleportation or dimensional rifts, treating the aircraft not as a vehicle, but as a catalyst for a paranormal event. They analyzed the flight path not as a series of turns made by a pilot, but as a geometric pattern. They looked for meaning in the silence of the cockpit, suggesting the crew had encountered something that defied physics. These discussions often ignored the concrete evidence, like the flaperon found on the shores of Reunion Island, because a piece of plastic washed up on a beach doesn't fit the narrative of a plane that transitioned to another dimension. Even the skepticism within these communities created its own drama. On the UFO forums, battles broke out between those who believed the airliner video was a smoking gun and those who pointed out that the footage was likely a digital fabrication or a clip from a movie. They argued over timestamps and pixels, trying to debunk or prove a video that had no verified origin. It became a game of digital forensics played by amateurs, where the goal wasn't necessarily to find the truth, but to win the argument. This mythology persists because it turns a story of loss into a story of mystery. It transforms the passengers from victims of a disaster into characters in a global enigma. When we talk about secret bases and anomalous sightings, we are no longer talking about the cold reality of a crash in the southern Indian Ocean. We are talking about the edges of the map, the places where the known world ends and the unknown begins. The internet didn't just search for Flight 370, it built a legend around it, ensuring that even if the wreckage is never found, the story will never truly stop. Why is it that we can map the surface of Mars in high resolution, but we cannot find a 140-ton piece of metal in our own ocean? That is the question that lingers long after the engines stop and the search crews go home. When you look at the financial records of the search for Flight 370, the numbers are staggering. This wasn't just a rescue mission. It became the most expensive search operation in the history of aviation. Millions of dollars were poured into the southern Indian Ocean, funding a fleet of ships and aircraft that combed through thousands of square miles of some of the deepest, most rugged terrain on Earth. The search was a multinational effort involving the governments of Malaysia, Australia, and China. They used side-scan sonar and autonomous underwater vehicles to scan the seabed, looking for the distinct silhouette of a Boeing 777. They were searching for the black boxes, the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder, which are designed to ping for 30 days after crash. But the batteries ran dry, and the silence that followed was absolute. By May 2015, the priority search area had been largely covered, and the world was left with a void where an answer should have been. The frustration of this failure is what keeps the story alive. In any other aviation disaster, there is a moment of clarity. A piece of wreckage is found, a black box is recovered, and a board of inquiry issues a final report that says exactly what went wrong. But for Flight 370, the official reports are filled with gaps. They use phrases like undetermined and inconclusive. The final documents acknowledge that while the aircraft likely ended up in the southern Indian Ocean, the exact coordinates remain a mystery. This lack of closure creates a psychological vacuum. When the official record is empty, people fill that space with their own narratives. This is why the internet remains obsessed. On platforms like Reddit and various aviation forums, the conversation never actually ended. There are threads with thousands of comments where amateur sleuths analyze satellite imagery or argue over the drift patterns of ocean currents. They aren't just looking for a plane, They are fighting against the idea that something this large could simply vanish. To the human mind, a total disappearance feels like a glitch in reality. We are conditioned to believe that in the age of GPS and constant connectivity, everything is tracked. Flight 370 proved that we can still lose something entirely. The pain of this absence is felt most acutely by the families of the 239 people on board. For them, the lack of a main wreckage site isn't a puzzle to be solved on a forum. It is a permanent state of limbo. Without a crash site, there is no definitive proof of the moment of impact, no recovery of remains, and no final resting place. The financial cost of the search is a matter of public record, but the emotional cost of the silence is immeasurable. Every time a new theory emerges or a documentary is released, it reopens a wound that was never allowed to heal because the evidence was never found. Even the physical clues that did surface, like the flaperon on Reunion Island, only added to the haunting nature of the case. Finding a single piece of a wing thousands of miles from the suspected crash site confirms the plane is gone, but it doesn't tell us how. It tells us the ocean is vast and the currents are powerful, but it leaves the cockpit a mystery. It is a fragment of a truth that remains incomplete. We are left with a story that refuses to end. It persists because it challenges our sense of security. We trust the systems, the radars, and the satellites to keep us safe and visible. But Flight 370 is the ghost in the machine. It is the reminder that there are still places on this planet where the map is blank, and where the deep water can swallow a modern marvel without leaving a trace. As long as the main wreckage remains hidden in the dark of the Indian Ocean, the world will keep looking. Not because we expect a miracle, but because we cannot accept the silence. The mystery of Flight 370 isn't just about a missing airplane. It is about the fear of the unknown and the haunting realization that some questions may never have an answer. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to Sleepwalk Files to stay up to date with new mysteries and long videos to fall asleep to every night.